University of Alaska up in Fairbanks. Yeah, sorry, I just completely blanked on that. Up in Fairbanks. She's with the Department of Anthropology and Northern Studies. She's been collecting stories from Cordova residents and seasonal fishermen. And I'll let her kind of explain more about what she does with the stories, but it sounds like a really cool project. So thank you for coming.
Great. Well, there's actually kind of two sets of things that I do. One of them is collect stories from fishermen, and one of them is try to finish a dissertation, which I'm not done yet, obviously. But the thing that I found that's working the best for me as I started my research project was to get stories not just from fishermen, but from people who've been involved in fishing. And I turn the stories, I take an interview and I turn it into a monologue, or what I'm calling a portrait, where I take myself out of the interview and turn it into the voice of the person speaking. And I put in details, like where we were sitting, where we had the interview, some of the other things the person mentioned to me, maybe not at the time of the interview, but just as if it's someone that I've known for a long time. And then I do the readings. I can do it like what I'll do tonight as just a one person portrait, or I can do it in a longer stage setting, a performance like a theater space, where I have maybe 4 or 5 people with me who I can give the stories to and set it up as kind of like a series of portraits that can show a specific fishery. And I'm working on my PhD now, so I'm mostly for PhD work, interviewing Cordova fishermen, but for my undergraduate work and for my master's work, I was interviewing fishermen in the Bering Sea cod fishery across the entire gear spectrum. And so I still use some of those interviews in my larger performance pieces because they make good stories, and I like stories. So then this piece that I actually just decided to put up here right when we came in tonight is for a performance that I just did, or a presentation I just did at the American Anthropology Association meeting. I had a piece there that I called Sea Change, No Fish. You'll see it flash up there at some point, SEA Change, KNOW Fish. And these pictures are mostly from personal family photos. My family's been in Alaska a pretty long time. So that's where they came from. I thought I might as well throw them up there so you guys have something to look at.
You're jealous of the razor clamps.
There are not so many of them anymore. But yeah, so I'll just let that go in the background. See if there's anything else I should add. I do want to say that this piece that I put together, I guess I'll tell you a little bit about this one. I'm calling it Raise the Bar, and this one's kind of a newer one that I'm just starting to work on. I haven't presented it before, and I just want to make sure I note at the very beginning that this is not to discredit any men who are 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, or any later generations of Cordova resident fishermen, but I've interviewed quite a few men who are, well, I'm going to say men because that's what this group is, who are maybe 2nd generation fishermen, so in the age range of about 25 to 35, and kind of took about, I think in this case, 3 interviews and meshed them together into one piece that I'm calling Raise the Bar. So I think I'll start. It's the second, Raise the Bar. It's the 2nd generation. These young men, maybe 25 to 35, grew up in Cordova, and they always knew they wanted to fish. They never expected or wanted anything else, and in fact, they never looked for anything else. There's a little bit of conceit in the tone of voice. They're very proud of their gear and the long-term experience. And I hear some judgment. One guy says, some guys just can't figure out how to make a living this way. I don't know why they do it. They can't figure it out. But then there's us. I know I could never do anything else. I never have. I've never had a job where I was paid by the hour. I honestly don't think I could handle it. If this wasn't around, if I couldn't fish, I don't know what I'd do. I gotta have it, you know? And do I know? I look at him a little skeptically. I think I might, kind of, because I have a little brother about that age and he's pretty proud of himself and his boat too. And I want to remind them, don't forget to thank Dad. You guys are the ones who have it easy. We're in the harbor, early summer. They've already had a few days to open the season. The bustle is everywhere. Every single person who passes the boat gives a little chin shift in our direction. I'm asking basic questions about what it's like to fish out there. And I guess I want to stop here and say, I do take people's names out of these. If there's something that you recognize, which I know in a small town might happen, I'll apologize now. But it doesn't have any names. The Copper River, compared to a lot of other fisheries in the state, is on a delta with sandbars. And they're similar to Bristol Bay, which is a lot different than the inside of Prince William Sound or Southeast Alaska, where you're mostly fishing against islands, beaches, rock points. That open flat water changes the dynamic because it changes from high tide to low tide dramatically. And there's a portion of the fleet that only fishes in shallow water areas and on bars, and a certain portion of the fleet that will never fish there. Then other parts of the fleet that will fish anywhere the fish are. Where folks are comfortable includes knowledge, experience, and sometimes a hint of intimidation. It could be very alarming fishing on the beach where you have an ocean swell and the breakers coming in, or on the bars where it goes out to breaking waves. Some people use that to their advantage because they're more comfortable and they know how to work their equipment. It's harder work and a little more dangerous and also a little more fun, but it can also really pay off. You have a portion of the fleet that can do that, and then a portion that will only fish in the ocean where you never have to worry about snags, never have to worry about going dry, or it's a lot easier on your gear and everything else. The group that fishes the inside waters, when it's open and the bars tend to be more of the local Cordova fleet, we kind of grew up with the option. Our boats now are the twin-engine 800 horsepower boats, are big and aluminum, and they can handle heavier weather. Before that, they were fishing in an open water skiff, and it was entirely an inside the barrier islands fishery. And when the tide was running hard and people just anchored up, people would fish at the change of the tides, a little bit on the flood, a little on the ebb, but mainly just the change of tides. And now we fish constantly. So I guess in general, the fleet has become more effective. Our nets are better, our boats are better. We work in groups and fish entirely when it's open. And that's why we have shorter 12-hour openers in the early season, because the fleet is very effective at getting on the fish. In the 80s, maybe even the late 70s, people started getting jet boats, and that's when the changes really started. When my dad started fishing right around 1970, he started in an open skiff without a cabin and a kicker. That was pretty common. Then people started getting doghouse cabins on their boats. That's what they call them. I don't even really know what that looks like, but they call them doghouses. And maybe some of you guys do. Then in the 80s, people Then in the 80s, people started building aluminum jet boats and nicer fiberglass jet boats. They were in the 24 to 26 foot range. And then later in the 80s, they got up to 29 feet. And then in the 90s is when people first started building the 32 foot, more similar to the Bristol Bay bow pickers. And that kind of evolved into this one, where we're standing. This boat here is a 2-year-old boat. There aren't really size limits. You could fish your seine boat out there if you wanted to. A couple people do that here and there, like if they don't have a second boat. But there's a lot of tide, and it takes a lot of time to get out and a lot of time to get back. So having a boat that can plane helps a lot. Something fast. Fast is good. Fast is pretty necessary. Yeah, we're not a very efficient fishery, that's for sure. Way back in the day, even before my dad, or right up to when my dad was a kid, the boats would still leave from town, but they'd stay out much longer. It wasn't running back and forth like now. Families would just go out there and stay at Castle, for instance. I'm sorry if I pronounced this incorrectly. Or Copanini. Did I get it?
What'd you say?
Copanini?
Coconini.
Copanini?
Coconini.
Okay. They would camp out there all summer long, and people would have certain sets that got labeled to their family name, and nobody else would ever even think to mess with them. Different people had different spots. They'd just be there, and nobody messed with that. That's all changed now. And I guess that would have been pre-permit. We weren't limited entry until 71 or something like that. The biggest feature of this fleet, self-employed, business owners, single, I mean, it's a one-man thing to do. We mostly fish solo. It's not like other fishing boats, like seiners or longlining. Then you have a crew and you're dealing with people. With this fleet, well, some people do take crew, but a lot of people just do it by themselves. I prefer to do it by myself. I think that changes the attitude of the fishery and what's going on and how people act, and you do different things. You can be a pretty weird person and maybe be on your own. It's a hodgepodge of people out there. You've got a lot of individualists. Everybody has their own ways. Sometimes it makes it hard to do group work, but that's also what makes it cool. We're proud to be able to work on our own. I never like taking someone else, but I had a friend come on this last opener yesterday, and it feels weird when there's someone there, and I get cranky and pissed off for a while because I wasn't catching fish, and my group members were. I just picked the wrong spot to start. But when it's just me, I can be as cranky as I want and have a really bad attitude and nobody knows. But when somebody else is there, I think, I don't know, maybe you should play some mellow music for them. I remember that person laughing a lot right then. So I was asking him about making sets. I'm pretty new to the drift fishery. I've mostly grown up on seiners and haven't spent very much time on the drift boat. this next part is him describing a set to me. Each time you put your net out, you call it a set. How many you can do in a day really depends. Right now we get 12-hour openers, and I don't think I left my net for more than 20 minutes until like 2 hours into it. I was just guessing and checking because we only have 12 hours and you're trying to find the fish. You gotta find them before you catch them. I work with a group of fishermen and we spread out, so we're finding exactly where the best and the most fish are. And maybe there are a couple areas that are producing fish, but based on where they are, you might also be able to guess where they'll be on the next tide. So the first couple hours, it was lots of sets, and by the end, I was leaving the net for an hour and a half at a time because I was in the fish. They were hitting my net. You don't want to leave the net too much longer than that because the fish will start drying in the net. But if it takes you 15 or 20 minutes to pull it in, and you're getting 20 or 30 fish an hour, in those 15 or 20 minutes, you might have just missed 10 fish, and at $4 something a pound, that's $250 that you missed by picking your net too often. When you're really in the fish, a lot of times, you might pick half and then set it back out. Then pick the other half and set it back out. You're always supposed to have one end attached to the boat, except for if you're swapping ends or doing things like that. You're not supposed to leave your net unattended, but sometimes you can just switch ends really fast. I think it's the law. For lots of reasons, a hazard, or if something happens to you when you leave the net out there. I'm not really sure why we have to do that. There are other user groups in the fishery, other groups that want the fish anyway, personal use, dip net, subsistence, that sort of deal. We're all enforced very heavily. We know exactly how many fish we catch to the number, and we know exactly how many fish we send up the river from here, with a great sonar that is really high quality. We all kind of gawked at that sonar when I first saw it, and we thought, they missed the fish, they missed the fish. But then I worked for Fish and Game, and I sat there and watched it count fish. It was pretty impressive. The sonar is right at the mouth of the river, right at the $1 Million Bridge. You can see it right there. You know, I kind of feel like the commercial fishermen are the ones that are the stewards and protectors of the river. And when I talk to the other user groups, like at Board of Fish meetings, they feel that it's a right to a certain number of fish, not necessarily protecting the salmon themselves. They just want to have their fish because they're allowed a certain number of fish, and that's all they care about. With us, that number changes drastically every year, and I think for the most part, the fleet doesn't really mind. Of course, you want to catch as much as possible, but it's the fishery first. We gotta have the fish to have the fishery. Those upriver folks don't watch out for returns. They're just looking for what they can take right now. It's pretty competitive in the fishery. There are 540 or 540 some odd permits, and it's a full access fishery. Nearly every single one is being used. There are people out there that aren't really competitive and just go and do their thing and maybe not talk to any other people, and they're having a good time. But there's a good portion, I'd just be guessing if I said a number, but I would say a couple hundred of the fishermen, maybe 300 or 400, that are very, very competitive. They have their own distinct groups that they work with, and we know the different groups out there, what boats are in each group. That's one thing about my radio group. We don't talk about who's in it, so people know some of our boats, but nobody outside of our group could probably name all of the boats in the group. That plays to our advantage quite a bit. Most groups are about 5 or 6. Most people in the fleet do recognize each other, and sometimes that makes it hard to cork somebody, but you gotta do what you gotta do, you know? There have been some really big changes over the years, and I'm thinking of history besides what I've seen. The 1964 earthquake changed the water level. It dropped the water level by 6 feet. So that changed. Before, you could run across the top of the barrier islands at a much earlier tide than you can now. And after that, in 1980 or 81, there were no reds out there that year for whatever reason. And so they actually made it so you had to fish king gear, so 6-inch mesh or bigger, so the reds would go through. And that was kind of an interesting year, and I've never heard of that happening again. Now you can't fish anything over 6-inch mesh size, and mesh size for red is usually between 5 and 5 1/4. I fish 5 1/8 right now. And then of course there is the oil spill, and I'm not the perfect person to tell you about the Copper River for the spill because of my age, but I don't think the spill had a whole lot of extended effect out there. Maybe in marketing. That was 89. If anything, it showed us we better know. We better know what to do if that happens again. I'm not that old, you know. When I was in high school, we went through a few years that I remember people calling the Salmon Crisis. We just weren't getting the right prices for the work. The prices were really, really low. All my buddies in those years could not wait to stop feeding salmon. That's all we had. It was cheap, and those were kind of grim years. I don't know, I think it was 93, 94, 95. Eventually I started to like fish again. And now I eat it 3 to 4 times a week. The good thing about that time was that the permits were low, and I got my own gear when I was 14. Then you could do it for 50 grand for a boat and permit, and now it's more like 200. I have participated in other fisheries quite a bit. It's kind of scaled back to just gill netting and seining though. I longline for quite a while, and I like longlining, but I don't own quota. And being a deckhand, it seems like you'd get that good job, and as the money grew in the fishery, the captains just found a way not to pay their crew as much. So it never really grew for me. And I invested into this instead of into quota. So I'm kind of behind on that one. I'm not into the quota scene. It just doesn't make sense. It's not fair to the guy actually fishing the quota and then the lazy one who leases it. He's just down in Seattle doing nothing and still gets 70% of the pay. And that's embarrassing. That's not a real fisherman. I like the fishery. It's fun work to catch halibut, but you kind of have to sell yourself to do it. Just go lower than the next guy. So how did I start? I started with my dad. I was a really young guy, and I liked the idea of fishing. My dad was a fisherman, and I wanted to be a fisherman. I was about 4 when I first remember going, and I think he took me even earlier than that. 4 was when I went seining. I think he started taking me gill netting when I was about 3. He'd take me and my brother and give us little practice jobs. He'd do it later in the season when it wasn't quite as important and the weather was good. We'd only fish inside. We wouldn't go out in the ocean. He'd let us walk around on the beaches, and it was just kind of a neat adventure for us at that age. I remember playing with Dungeness crab on the deck, prodding and poking them and watching them climb around. We played with all the lines and tied knots and folded up Dad's tarts, and probably drew on them when we weren't supposed to. But the Copper River's the place for me. It's not just the fishing, and this goes back to the area being special. These fish, some people might say, it's just marketing on the Copper River. But these are the best salmon in the world. Especially right now, in the first couple weeks, there's nothing better. People will start out by saying, oh yeah, whatever. And then they have your fish, and they say it is the best salmon they've ever had. But having fresh salmon, like tonight, we'll have king salmon. And king is a totally different thing compared to any other salmon. That's really neat. It also goes beyond the fishing as well. The subsistence aspect of it, well, I'll call it subsistence. We bring in personal use fish, and we do batches in the smokehouse, and give it away as gifts, and we have it to eat all winter. It's a pretty special thing, and I would never give that up. And I think there's a really good community here in Cordova, especially in the winter time when all the summer chaos straightens out and the people from the summertime leave. The community stands together. Like if somebody gets hurt or if some bad things happen, there are potlucks and people raise money and people donate things to help them out. When you walk around, you can wave to anybody. It's not necessarily your friend, but you know them. Everybody is smiling and waving. I'll go to Anchorage and people look at me goofy because I walk into a restaurant and start waving to people and saying hi, and they're just like, who are you? Why are you looking at me? So it's kind of neat to live here. I'd say it's a close community. It's a beautiful, rainy place with Copper River salmon. What else would you want? So. I need my water. Do you guys have any questions about the project at all?
Is this like an oral history or oral impression, or?
My main advisor in school for academic work is at oral history, so I would call it oral history. So what's going on with the research work? There's one like academic dissertation, study oral history and what that means. That's one side of the picture. But then what I'm actually doing with these is much more like public performance. I would do it in a place like the Fisher Poet things that I know that you've had them here. But we have Fisher Poet stuff on the Kenai every once in a while. There's a big organization that does it in Oregon also. But I also really like doing these, and what I'm starting to find as I'm looking at some of the issues with salmon in the state and the way that salmon's managed, is that if I can take a story like this, like a story from a a story from a commercial fishery, a single person, and tell how they got into it, why they like it, what they're doing with it as a career, and explain that in the context of something where there's a lot of conflict, like in the Kenai, for example, right now, we have a lot of conflict there. But when I can take a story, it seems to get a message across better sometimes. Although that doesn't always work in public policy, it's a nice way to try. So.
I would ask, on the UAF website, there's a Project Jute all over Alaska. If anybody here hasn't visited it, I would recommend it. And ask if, are you taking these histories that you're doing, and do you have any plans to add them to something like that, where there are pictures of the people who have been interviewed and it's indexed so you can quickly find things that you might be interested in, or is that too laborious to?
Bill Schneider, the person who used to run Project Jukebox, is actually my main advisor. He's a retired faculty now, so he's not actually working Project Jukebox, but he's been very supportive of what I'm doing. But I think because of the way that I've had to put it into the dissertation IRB, Institutional Review Board of Standards of using people's names and things like that, I can't just take these interviews and make them public without turning it into some component that's not research related. I can't tell you who I just interviewed in this piece, even if you can guess. Or if it does have too many names in it, I have to take them out. If I read this in Kenai, I might be able to leave the person's first name in there. But if I read it here, I need to remove them. So I would like to. I mean, that sounds like a great idea, but not with my work. But
And that's because of this IBR?
It's the Institutional Review Board.
Okay.
It's administered within an educational concept and bureaucracy. I had to do the same thing for my master's thesis. However, working for unaffiliated organizations, like with the state, I worked for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, or when I worked for the Bristol Bay Native Association, or when I worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I've worn a number of different hats. The work that we do adheres to the standards of research in the North. There's a number of different little things, little boxes we check off. But one of the things that we do, let's say here with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, when we conduct interviews, we return them to the communities where they were conducted. The people who participated in the interviews gets a copy of manuscripts, and then they're housed in a number of different public places. And Project Jukebox would willingly take our interviews if half the time we remember to do that. It's more of a procedural thing than anything else. So we're not limited. Our hands aren't tied
if I interview someone, I have to have their signature to interview them, and on their signature page it says this is going to be used for the purposes of my dissertation.
and only
Yeah.
that, really.
Which is kind of annoying, but
How much more school do you have to?
I should be done hopefully in June.
Nice.
But you're done with all your classwork, your
Yeah,
coursework.
I'm totally
You've done
finished.
your comprehensives, your exams.
Yeah.
And so the only thing is to finish up the writing that you're doing.
Yeah, and I just spend a lot more time, and I would rather spend more time on these pieces that are not actually, I mean, I can't take a volume of 65 interviews and say, here's my dissertation. It's got to be a little more structured than that, unfortunately. So, this is the fun part though. Should I take those off? No, they're lovely.
So where else have you done these public performances besides?
I've done
I
them.
mean, have you done them at Board of Fish or?
I haven't done it at Board of Fish. I don't know if how I could do that. It would be pretty fun to try and say, because I'm involved with this Kenai stuff to some degree, to interview a set netter, adrift, and then some of the sport, and actually show that in some conditions they really want the same thing. They want to have access to fish, and they actually like some of the same things, and if they just could talk to each other instead of yell at each other, it might be helpful. But I don't know how I could do that. But I've done it in places like art galleries or small theaters. We have a small theater in Homer where I'll have people come up and read with me. I read something last year at the it's that bar down there that's kind of by the Science Center.
Anchor?
Yeah.
Anchor bar?
Someone organized something last summer that I did. I don't know, just wherever. It often works well